I want to let you know that this last fall, we had a deacon and a staff retreat. There's some material that I brought to the guys and some of the girls that are on staff here at the church. And we just talked about some of the things that have to do with ministry. And so what they did after that was over, they said, Gary, you really need to share that with the church. And so today and next Sunday, it's going to be a little bit different. It's not preaching per se, as it is so much is talking about ministry and about the church. Now, here's some things I want you to remember about the church, because the church is incredibly important to God. The church is the bride of Christ. We are God's household, and He has gifted you with spiritual gifts, with abilities, with talents, with resources. I mean, He's just done all sorts of things in our lives so that He can work through us to reach a lost world with the gospel of Christ, to reach people who are far from God and to bring them near to Him through faith in Jesus Christ. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to talk about ministry. I want to talk about the church. And it's not preaching so much as it is teaching and talking about some of the things that we have learned about ministry. So the best way to kind of explain this Sunday and next Sunday is just, it's a timeout for just a moment. We do that with our kids when they're misbehaving. We're like, hey, go sit in timeout. And what we're saying to them is whatever it is that you're doing right now, I just want you to stop and I want you to go sit down and I want you to think about what you've been doing so that you correct that behavior. And that's not necessarily true in church as it is for our kids. Sometimes in an argument with your husband or your wife, you're like, timeout, things get hot, it gets a little heated, people are upset. You're like, hey, let's just stop this for a minute, come back together in a second, and let's talk about these things. Or if you think about just sports, I mean, football, volleyball, basketball, it doesn't matter. People call timeouts. They're in the middle of a game. They want to stop all the activity. They want to stop all the competition for just a second. But just think about why it is that coaches call for timeouts. Because they got somebody that's just lost their mind and they're angry and they need to calm them down. Or they've got people that they're really not engaged in the game and they need to talk to them to try and get them re-engaged into what's going on. But really what happens most of the time in a timeout in any sport is they talk strategy. They're like, okay, here's what's been happening. Here's what's going on right now. And what do we need to do to make some changes? What are some things that we need to do to make sure that when we go back in for the next play or the next round, that everything is as it is supposed to be, that we succeed and that we compete well and that we win the game. And I'm not trying to equate church with a game because those two things don't compare to one another. But there are times in church ministry where we just need to say, hey, time out for a minute and let's talk about church. Because I realize that most people, they really don't get church. I mean, we show up to church, we've been in church, we've heard the preaching, we've been to the singing, we've maybe served in some things like VBS or some concert that we've had. But really, when it comes to ministry, sometimes we don't fully understand it. I know that I didn't. I mean, I got saved and I went to church. I even worked around a church for a little while when I was a college student. I went to seminary for 4 years. I did not understand what happened in a church until I was in one. And we're like, really? This is what goes on behind the scenes. I didn't get that. We hire so many different people here with the weekday preschool and sometimes here on staff. And the conversation is always the same. Here's what they say. They say, I never knew. I never knew that all this went into this. I never knew that you did all these things just to be able to have an effective ministry to people in the community. It's a lot like going to a football game. You show up to the Texans, Redskins. I don't know if any of you guys went. I'm sorry if you did. But some of you went and you were there and you show up and the stadium's open. The lights are on. There's somebody playing music. There's somebody talking. They've got all the referees on the field. They've got all the sidelines people. They got all the medical personnel. I mean, they've got all these folks that are there. You've sat down, you bought your hot dog and your Coke and all the stuff that you needed to enjoy the game. And unless you sat down and really thought about everything that happened to make that event go on, you just wouldn't realize it. But then when you start thinking about some somebody had to hire the ump. Somebody had to make sure that all the referees knew what they were doing. Somebody had to make sure all the correct medical personnel were there. Somebody was there training greeters and people to be at the doors and the security folks that are around. Somebody came early and made sure all the lights were working. They had sound checks before you showed up. And that's not even covering all the coaches and the game plans and the meetings and the players and them trying to be medically ready to be able to go out there and compete on the field in a good way. And then just the game itself. And so sometimes what we do in church is we show up and we really never think about all the ministry that happens for this to happen on Sunday morning, or for what we do on Wednesday nights to happen, or for the concerts and the vacation Bible schools and all the stuff that happens in a church ministry. And so really what I want to do today is just talk about ministry, talk about the church, tell you a little bit about this church, where we are and where we have been and kind of where we're headed, so that we take the time out, we do the strategy talk, and then we get rolling for the rest of the year, okay? And so that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to work through here. Now, this is a good phrase. It's true in all of your life. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today, they're true in church. They're true in your marriage. They're true in your job. If you own your own business, it's especially true of you. But Albert Einstein said that the significant problems we face today cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. So if you're 40 years old and you're having problems in your marriage, you can't use the styles and the tactics that you did when you were 20 years old. Because you're not 20, your wife's not 20, your kids, they're here, they're probably adolescents by then. You can't go about doing life at 40 the way you did it when you're 20. If you're trying to do that, you've probably heard from your wife, I wish you would grow up. Right? I mean, that's what she says to us when we're trying to act like a 20-year-old and we're 35 or we're 40 years old. There's a progression that God expects all of us to go through in our marriages, in relationships, and even in churches. And so the way that you lead, the way that you pastor, the way that we do ministry as a church today, it's not the same as it was 15, 10, 5 years ago. And so there are three aspects of church ministry that challenge all the leaders. There's a cycle, a life cycle that churches go through in their life, and we'll work through that in just a second. The size of a church, I mean, how many people are attending a church, impacts its health and vitality. You can't lead a large church the same way that you lead a small church. We have more in common with a church of a different denomination, maybe not theologically, but we have more in common of a church with a different denomination who are the same size as we are than with a Southern Baptist church that's running 40 on Sunday morning. Because we're going to share more in common with those churches. And then third, what got your church to where it is will not get it to where you want it to be. And so just like in your marriage, just like in your business, if you've grown your business, you know what got you there is not what's going to get you to the next step. You got to change. There's got to be some evolution, some progression in how you do business, where you do business, who you do business with, how we do church. I mean, those things have to be able to change and progress as life moves on. And so taking our church to the next level, other than our basic beliefs and values, the two major forces that impact the church's growth are its age and its size. Now let me tell you, I've talked about this last month or so a little bit in church. But our church age isn't really what you might think it is, because the church was founded in 1957. This church, over time, if you've been around, if you're like one of the longtime members, has been through a lot of life cycles of life and death and growing and stability, and we'll look at those in a second. But really, this church is, as we sit right now, the congregation, the people who are here, we're about 12 to 15 years old. When I came about 20 years ago, there was the first 5 years or so was just kind of getting everything stable, just kind of like fixing stuff and getting everything kind of moving again, restarting ministries that had kind of died along the way. And so really, as a congregation, our buildings aren't this old, but as a congregation, we're somewhere 12, 15 years old. And then as a church size, we're about a 400-member church on a kind of a typical Sunday. No, you can't count December because all you guys disappear and go travel. But that's about the size of a church that we are. So these congregational life cycles, Pat Riley said this. He said, a team can be great for 20 years or more. I was talking about basketball, obviously. If the leaders can control the destructive forces and refocus the players on the mission. So you got James Harden on your team and you're the Rockets coach, what do you got to do? It's like, James, come on, man. This is the vision. This is the mission. If you let James and Dwight Howard just kind of run crazy, then what happens is the team begins to break down. And so it's the coach's job to refocus the mission of the players. And if he can do that over a long period of time, you have success for a long time. Same thing's true in your family. You're going to have fights. You're going to have discussions. You're going to have those moments where you do not like each other. But it's going to be up to the husband and the wife to do what? To be able to refocus on the mission. To be able to move past those difficult points in the life cycle of the marriage so that you can continue to grow as people, so that your relationship can continue to grow. Same thing's true in a church. Anything that revolves around relationships, a team, sometimes your business, a lot of times businesses, churches, marriages, will go through this. You got to know what it is so that you can work against these forces to keep everything moving forward. Because when you don't, people get mad and upset. Sometimes people get divorced or they just stay mad for the rest of their marriage. Human life cycle, we understand what this is. I mean, you're born, you get older, childhood, adolescence, emerging adult, young adult. They actually say that young adults are 31 to 50, so that makes me still young. Middle adults, 51 to 70. Senior adults, 71 to 80. And then elderly adults, 80. And then y'all know what comes next. Life cycle of a congregation. Now, again, true marriage, true business, true church. Whenever you have the birth of a church, or in our case, the rebirth of a church, about 15 years ago, you have this birth and you begin to grow. And the church grows and grows and grows, the family grows, the business grows, and you hit this point of stability or plateau. Well, at that point of stability or plateau, you've got decisions to make. You have steps that you have to take. If you don't take these steps, you will hit a decline in your marriage, a decline in a church, and if you allow that decline to go on and you don't do anything to stop it, it'll die. Okay, the business will shut down, the marriage will end in divorce, the church will suffer. So you've got to begin to redefine who you are, what you exist for, what your purpose is, to begin to redevelopment of the purposes and how you're going to do all those things in the context of a ministry. And then what that does, if you do the redefinition and you do the redevelopment, then it creates a rebirth. And it kicks you off of the decline cycle, back onto a new growth cycle, and you continue to reach people for the Lord. Now, our vision, what is it? It is the same as it has always been. And that is to reach people who are far from Christ and to lead them to a personal relationship with Christ as their Savior. That never changes. I talked to one of our Bible study classes a few months ago, it was probably a couple months ago now. And there's a lot of things in church. It doesn't matter how contemporary you are, how modern or how traditional you are. There's a whole lot about church. It never changes. We will always worship. Now, music changes, okay, styles change, but we will always worship. We will always pray. We should always preach the gospel. The gospel, itself, the doctrine of God does not change. Those types of things, they don't change. The fact that we pray, that we worship, that we preach, that we come together, we gather together as a church, baptism, the Lord's Supper, it may look different. It may be packaged a little bit differently, but those things never change. There's some stylistic differences along the way about maybe how people preach or how they sing, but really those things never change. Church architecture has changed a little bit, but that's so expensive that it's difficult to change that very often in the life of a church. So you've got to continually go back to what your vision is and what you're supposed to be doing. Now, there's an example of this in the scripture, and it's from the book of Revelation. If you go read the first couple of chapters of Revelation, it talks about some of the churches. And what Jesus is saying is this. He's saying, I want you guys to repent. I want you to go back and do the things that you did at first. Remember, go back and return to your first love. And then he tells the churches this. He says, if you don't do that, he says, I will remove your lampstand. Now, what he's talking about is the church. He's like, I'll close the doors of the church. And so what was happening with these churches in the book of Revelation is they were in this life cycle. They were up on the stability, the plateau. We're in a rut stage, about to hit the decline. And Jesus is warning them, saying, hey, you better get this straightened out. If you feel like your marriage is in a rut, if you think your business is on a plateau, those are the red flags that you got to start changing things to reinstitute and re-begin, or to start some new life back into the relationships, the business, or the church that you've got. So here's what we know about the life cycle of a church. We're all inclined to follow this basic pattern. Every church, not just this one, all of them. Secondly, a church's growth and decline, they don't progress steadily from stage to stage. One might happen real fast, one may happen real slow. It just kind of depends on what's happening. And the longer a church is plateaued at one stage of growth, the more difficult it is to move to the next stage. I mean, if you've been fighting about the same thing for 20 years, how hard is it not to fight about that anymore? Incredibly difficult, because it's been there a long time. So the longer you are in that rut, on that plateau, in that spot, the harder it is to change those habits that got you there. And so you're the husband, you're the wife, it's your job to step in, fix those things quickly, don't let them linger. Same thing happens in a church as well. So what we know, some extremely dynamic situations, if a church grows real fast, some of these are compressed a little bit. Normally churches that remain vital for long periods of time experience not just one life cycle, but several, where there's growth and plateau, sometimes a little bit of decline, and they'll kick it back off again, they'll start growing again. Churches can experience renewal at any point in their life cycle. However, the older a church becomes and the later in the life cycle renewal is attempted, the more difficult it is to experience growth and vitality. Again, it's just the longer you got bad habits in place, the harder it is for you to change it. I mean, how about New Year's? If you've been doing things for the last 10 years, like just say you smoke. You're like, hey, I'm going to quit smoking. I've been doing it for the last 25 years. Going to be hard to change. It's going to be very, very difficult. If you picked it up 6 months ago, a whole lot easier to lay it down. So there's just a principle that is true in all of life. Just some questions for you. I mean, do you see that life cycle? What do you see? Where are you in that life cycle? In your personal life, your spiritual life, your marriage, your business? And then what do we see here at the church? And we'll talk about us. So this is where we've been as a church. Now I'm going to start about 15 years ago or so. Where we've been is an emerging church. James Conant says, behold the turtle. He only makes progress when he sticks his neck out. Isn't that true? You're not going to solve anything in a marriage until somebody steps up and brings it up and talks about it. You're not going to move on in a church until we take that, what Jesus calls a step of faith, and trust God for what he has for us. Second thing is that the emerging church or stage of a church is unusually challenging and exciting as a dream for a new church is conceived, nurtured, birthed, and stabilized. Now he's talking about a church that is just a brand new church plant, and our story is a little bit different because of our history. Technically, this stage lasts around 5 years, and that begins with the church's first worship service. The mission is clear. People are excited. They're committed. They're willing to work. Yeah, 50% or more of the church is actually serving. There's high morale, positive hope for the future, bare bones organization because it's small. If you just start a business, it's going to be you and maybe your wife or husband, and then there's nobody else. Change is the only constant. It's viewed as positive. There's a visionary leader, a doer of ministry. It's like you got the idea and you're doing it. And that's what happens in an emerging church. And the key question is, who are we? What are we going to be and who are we going to be? And we've had to answer that question along the way as a church body ourselves. So here's also where we've been, emerging church, but also a growing church. Now for the growing church, that goes up to about 200 people in attendance. And so this is where we've been. It's not where you are today that counts, it's where you're headed. And so the first 10 to 20 years of a church's existence are quite often the best in terms of its numerical growth. And we're still in that, depending on how you gauge the age of our church, we're still in the middle of that right now, 12 to 15 year apart. Indeed, there's a tendency in some churches to take from 20 to 25 years to reach their maximum size. So, in fact, most churches, the largest worship attendance occurs between the 15th and the 20th years of their cycle. And so far, that's proving true for us as a congregation as well. Here's some characteristics: strong sense of mission and purpose, high level of goal ownership, excited about what God is doing. Volunteers are easily located. That is true of you, unless it's 30 degrees outside and raining, and then you don't want to be on the golf carts. People donate their time, their talent, their treasure. New people are quickly involved in the ministry of the church. The morale continues to build. Core values are stronger. First building units are completed. Now, in our case, that was a long time ago. Vision for more property and facilities, we've had that. Programs develop in response to need, and traditions begin to form. And we have, over the last 15 years or so, this church has begun to build traditions. And namely, I would think of the Christmas Eve service that we've got. That's become a tradition here in the church that wasn't here about 12, 15 years ago. Some of the characteristics, attitude towards change in a growing church. Changes are easily adopted, they're integrated, they're determined by mission and vision. It's like, what are we doing? So that's okay, we're going to do it, we're going to change. Accepted by everybody. It doesn't mean that some people don't, but just the majority of people, they're like, hey, that's okay, we're going to do that. There's a full-time pastor and secretary. We've been down that route already. Sets an example as a worker and delegates to volunteers. Worship attendance may need multiple worship services, which we do. Our sanctuary will not fit our church in one service. People are regular in attendance. They invite and they bring their friends and family. And a key question for them is not who they are, but really, what do we do with the resources that we've got? Because, for every church, it's going to be limited. So you have to make decisions about it. You can't spend money on everything. And so you try and figure out where it is that you need to spend those money. Challenges for the growing church. And we've met these. Mostly, it's not that we're perfect, and I'll tell you about one of our imperfections in a minute. But we've got new management systems, finances are dealt with professionally, assimilation processes, higher quality ministry, expansion of facilities, clear pathway to leadership. Breaking the 200 barrier is a significant issue for the stage in this church. And so we broke the 200 barrier. And when you talk about barriers, it's not just like one time you break it, it's you bounce around that number until you just finally just clear it. And we broke the 200 barrier probably 9 years ago, something in that neighborhood. So where we are now, this is where we are. That's where we've been, so this is where we are. Consolidating church. Peter Drucker, he's a business guy, says there's surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all. And so whether it's a business or a marriage or even a church, sometimes we do what we've always done because that's what we've always done and that's the way we've always handled it. And there's really no point in doing it anymore, but we just do it because that's just what we do. And that was his point. It's like you get to this point of inefficiency and you just need to let things go sometimes. But the consolidating church, he says these churches are usually quite healthy. The first 20 years of ministry sparks growth that brings in new believers as well as those who wish for more energy in their spiritual lives. And then he says over time, however, people become tired of the continual challenges that growth brings and begin to desire stabilized ministry. And leaders sense it's time to consolidate what they've got. And with consolidation being defined as a stage of calmness as current ministries mature. Don't mishear what I'm saying. Nobody wants to keep your family in constant chaos with changes. Nobody wants to do that in a church. But there's a tendency sometimes at this stage of church growth to not be willing to change, to not be willing to press on and continue to reach those people who don't have a relationship with the Lord. So here's some of the characteristics. High visibility of mission. A second generation of members and newcomers are unaware of the mission. My children are second generation in this church. They don't understand where we came from, what was going on, the context of the church. I mean, they didn't get all that stuff. So part of the reason why I've shared over the last month a little bit about kind of the history of the church. People are involved. There's a mobilization system. Enthusiasm begins to wane. It's like people start looking around going, oh, I'm going to let somebody else do it. Or I've been there. I've done that. Let somebody else do the work now. And that's typical in every church. Morale is at its highest. Confidence that goals can be reached. People are appropriately proud. You can be appropriately proud of your children. We can be appropriately proud of our church. Buildings are completed, property is maxed out, and it is. And we'll show you guys some pictures and talk about that in a minute. Possible vision to relocate. This is not really an issue for us. It is for some churches. I like where we are. My goal, my vision is to just maximize our property and our facilities as much as we possibly can. We are bound by the land that is around us, and so maybe one day we would have to deal with those things, but not right now. Here's a picture of our parking. This is on one of our typical Sundays, and it was actually taken a couple of months ago. All the parking in front of the fellowship hall is full. All the parking across the front of the church is full. All the parking, except for a couple of visitor spots, is full on the side of the church. All the parking on the side, down on the lower level, down by the Gibbs property, that's all full. And then this lower level, the dirt parking lot, you guys know, there's a few spots that are left there. Since this picture was taken, we've cut the curbs up on the very top part. And so we have probably 76, 80 spots that are on dirt right now, which is fine if it's not raining. If it is raining, nobody wants to walk through mud. So we're trying to work on the whole facility and the parking thing right now as best we can, and I'll give you all some more details on that in a second. Programs and structures. Programs are formalized, ministries maximized, new ideas, leaders responsible for approval, people responsible for implementing new ideas. Pastor and staff. Pastor leads multiple staff, which we do have in the church now. Casey is our worship pastor. Craig is our associate pastor. Students, college. Rachel is running our weekday preschool as well as our preschool and children, which is a big job. I'm the pastor, and then you guys are doing innumerable ministries that are here in the church every week. The pastor primarily works with church leaders. The attendance center is full. We've got room in both services because of the size of it. But there may come a day that we don't. More inactive members are not missed. That's a bad thing, but that happens at this age of the church or size. Newcomers don't get connected because of overcrowding conditions. And the key question is, where do you go from here? I mean, like, what happens next? And I'll tell you, that happened to me after we built that building. You know, everything was so much about the building, about raising the money and getting to do the construction. You get done with it and you're like, what do you do now? I mean, where do we go from here? And I know where we go from here is that we continue to do what God has called us to do, and that's reaching out to those that are far from the Lord. Some of the challenges, to renew our vision and mission. That's what we're doing. That's what part of this is about this morning, is to renew our mission and our vision. It's about a theme that we're going to come out with in a couple of weeks about inviting people to Christ and to church and to small group Bible studies here on campus. There's a great danger at this point. And somebody else said this, but it's true in many, many churches, that the saddest day in the life of the church is when they burn their mortgage papers. And the reason why is because it kind of happened a little bit, and we still have a large mortgage on our building, so we haven't burned anything yet. But you focus so much on building a sanctuary or facilities. You have this big mortgage, and you work really hard, and you pay it off, and you burn it off, and then people look around, they're like, what do you do now? I mean, where do you go from here? I mean, that was the vision, and the vision's complete, and so what happens now? Envisioning a new direction for the church, your marriage, your business is a must at this stage of your life. And the lead pastors, it's me, must learn to keep the current ministry going while at the same time building a new dream for the future. So you got to keep what's going on, but you also have to build for the future. If you own a business, you got to keep doing what you're doing. You got to build for the future. You got to do those two things at the same time. Some more challenges, increasing the need of educating people about who we are and what we're doing. We continue to start new ministries, assimilating people into the church, developing leaders and workers and teaching disciples. We've had 2 new ministries start just within the last semester, our Camo Men's Ministry and our If Women's Ministry. And here's the great thing about that. I had nothing to do with it. Craig had nothing to do with it. Rachel had nothing to do with it. And Casey had nothing to do with it. It was you. You started those ministries. And that is the church being the church. And those ministries are going to reach new people for Christ. There's a limit to what I can do. There's a limit to what you can do. But as a church body, together, we are able to do so much more. Some of the other challenges, hiring additional pastors and support staff, relocating, enlarging current facilities. One of the leading causes of plateauing is related to the church's size of their facility, their parking area, and their grounds. And so here's a little bit about the parking stuff, because this is kind of the top conversation that we have with the deacons and the staff, is that we've talked to an engineer, because we live within the city limits, we just can't go do what we want to do. So the city or an engineer has to tell us what we can do, and we have to get that approved by the city. $8,500 just to have an engineer tell us, here's what you can do. And then we got to go through, we got to move dirt, and then we've got to come through and we've got to lay concrete. And so you're looking at probably $200,000 worth of concrete, dirt work that's out there. One parking spot, and I don't do this for a living, so you guys just let me speak generally here. One parking spot's about $2,000. And so that's about what that costs. And we've got about 76 parking spots out there, 80 parking spots, plus the engineering and the dirt work and the detention pond that's got to go because of runoff and things like that. So, but those things limit the growth of a church. We've had our greeters and our golf cart folks that are out there where people have come into the church parking lot and they've driven around, they've looked for a spot and they've left. Now, that may have been you and you said, hey, I'll be back next Sunday, but that could have been a guest. And y'all know what happens when you're away from God and you're like, hey, I need to get back. I need to go back to church. And you're driving in the parking lot and you're thinking, do I go or do I not? Do I stay or do I leave? And then you come in, you drive around for a little while and there's not a spot and you're like, hey, hallelujah. There's my excuse. Let's just leave. They're full. We're going to go eat breakfast. Okay? But that's how we think. That's how we think. And so we don't want that to happen to people. And so it's a real issue. And you wouldn't think about parking as integral to ministry, but it is. So here's some questions. You can ask this of yourself, your business, or our church. Are we in the consolidating stage? Yes, that's where we are. We're kind of new to that stage. We haven't been there for a very, very long time, but that's where we are right now.